Alright, welcome to Turbo's Tech Table. Today we're going to be going over a stack tube blowback design, most commonly known with a lot of spiders and spider clones. The marker I have in front of me here, this is actually from a company called Mocal. They're based out of Canada, but the base design and how it operates is identical to most spiders and spider clones. So it'll give you a good overview of how the whole thing functions and kind of some stuff to look out for when doing maintenance type stuff. So let's I'm going to be rebuilding this, but I'll save you guys the time and don't have to watch me put O-rings on and off. So of course, first thing, get rid of your peripherals, whatever you don't need that's kind of in the way. This is called macro hose if you don't know. The macro hose, it's a plastic hose and it goes into these fittings, and the way these things work is you have to push the collar in while you pull the hose out. Usually you can do that with one hand, but sometimes you get some stiff ones here. This one's going to be a difficult one. There it goes. And kind of as a rule of thumb, when you start seeing a big groove in these macro hoses here, this one's not too bad. It's kind of time to replace it. If you're ever, and you can cut this stuff to length, so if you're ever cutting it, use a nice sharp knife. I like to use box cutters. I've heard people using cigar cutters. Kind of whatever floats your boat in that arena though, as long as it's sharp and can make a nice clean cut. So on this guy, actually, I'm not going to bother with that, what I was just doing there. Usually these front blocks will come off. In this case, there's a Allen screw right underneath here, and that's the way it works on a lot of the spiders as well. Somebody definitely Loctited this in place. So on this one, what you have here in the foregrip is just a volumizer. It basically kind of stores CO2 or air for the next shot. And that's the same with the front piece here. This is also a volumizer. The reason you can tell they're volumizers and not regulators is there's no adjustments on the outside. And a regulator, for the most part, is always going to have some kind of an adjustment on the outside so you can increase or decrease the pressure. There's also expansion chambers out there, and the reason I know this is not an expansion chamber is because of its size. Expansion chambers are meant to work with CO2. You can run air through them. There's no downside to running air through them. They just don't give you any kind of benefit when you're working with air over CO2. For CO2, they give the liquid CO2 time to expand, or space to expand in. So when you pull these guys out, be a little careful because there is a spring right behind them. And so you don't want that guy to go flying. Usually they're okay, they won't go flying. But pull it out of the way, so get it out of the way. This is the poppet seal, it's called. Your valve spring and valve assembly itself. This one's a little different than some spiders, and I'll get into why in just a little bit. But the shaft here is completely round, which is actually kind of rare. Usually, here I have another one here. Here's another one. Usually, if you can see that, this one has a cutout. This one's actually cut on two sides. Usually at least one side they'll have this cut out. And that's to allow air to pass by the shaft. And I'll get into why a little later. It's partly to do with the recocking of the whole marker. But I'm not going to bother with the rest of this front block. There's really, if there's no problems, there's no reason to take it apart really. So don't bother with it unless you have to, I guess I'd say. And a lot of times these blowbacks, they'll all kind of come apart just a little bit different. Most spiders will have a pull pin back in the back here. Let me adjust this, hang on. they'll have a pull pin in the back area here, so you can get the internals out. This one works a little bit different. I'm seeing a set screw here, but I'm also wondering if it's held on by the frame screw here. So let's give that guy a try first. When you're doing a full breakdown of these, basically the last thing you need to get to is the valve assembly itself. And almost always, I've only come across like 2 cases where you do not have to take the frame off of the body in order to do that. Typically you take the frame off, and I'm willing to bet there's going to be a brass slotted screw, because I don't know why, it's always a brass screw underneath that holds the valve in place. I couldn't tell you why they're brass and why they're always a screwdriver that you need when everything else in paintball is Allen head. Hope you guys are learning something from my videos. If you want something in particular, let me know. Can't promise anything, but eventually I usually work on just about everything out there. Oh, and this time it is not a slotted screw, but it is still brass, if you can see that there. This guy is what's holding the valve in place. So when you get it to this part, you can see this part that's moving here, that's the hammer. And that O-ring is toast. So we're going to get this stuff out. Somehow. So this stuff was just held in place by the back cap here. This is the lower tube I'm taking out here. This is the mainspring. If you're having problems with your marker recocking all the way, or especially if you're having low velocity, the mainspring is usually the culprit. There's very few times where that's not the case. So I'll point out, this is normally how it kind of sits in there. This one is a little bit of a kind of odd situation here because of what's going on here with this secondary spring. This is not normal in most stack tube blowbacks. What they're doing here with this is it's either functioning as a bump stop, so when the marker resets itself all the way, it's acting as a cushion when everything flies back to reset itself. Or it's acting as a primary push on the bolt to give it a little extra speed moving forward. So bolt, hammer, this hammer O-ring, now I'm looking at it, is actually a proprietary O-ring. It's a cup seal kind of face on it instead of a normal round O-ring. I may replace that, I may not. There's ways of kind of making stuff work. But we still got the valve in there. Let's see how we get this out. Not with that one. And I got 2 screws for some odd reason. I'm willing to bet. Yep, this one, this brass screw, is holding the valve in place. And I'm betting the second one here is simply stopping the valve from moving back any more than it is, which is kind of an odd setup. There's no real reason for this second one to be here, because as long as your primary one there is still in place, you're still holding the valve in. So, but whatever, every company does stuff a little different. We'll get this guy out of here and go from there. So one of the ways, if I can find it, that I usually get this stuff out is with a push-through swab. Got it. Alright. Typically these valves will go out through the front. I have seen a few come out the back, but for the most part, just give them a shove, they'll come out. So here is our valve. And I can kind of assemble this so it is what it is when it's sitting in the marker. And then this little guy is holding the valve in place. So here's how it sits in the marker. When the marker is ready to go, I can't really do this with the spring in place, but everything is cocked back in the back position. You release the trigger, which there's a sear, which is just a piece of metal that holds onto the hammer here. That drops down, and then everything here flies forward and hits the valve, which is normally sitting like that. When it hits, it pushes it forward, which opens this front face here, and then that shoots air out the top here, which then that same hole that is holding the valve in place is also a passageway in between the two tubes, the top and bottom tube. So that comes up through there, goes in the bolt here, and then that's air that comes out the barrel. Now this is also functioning as, so when these two hit, these two holes are lining up. And it's only for a fraction of a second. But that's also functioning, this whole assembly coming forward is also pushing the paintball into the barrel. So then instead of being right below the hopper, it's in the barrel when the blast of air comes through. What happens after that, you see in this case, this is a little bit of an odd way to do this. And now hopefully you guys can see this, but there's 4 little cutouts around this hole on the back side of the valve face. And what those cutouts are is they're allowing space around the valve stem. So when this valve is opened, most of the air is going up through the bolt, but there's still some air that passes through those little cutouts and is in between the space between the valve and the hammer. And what that does is it pushes the hammer back, and then it resets the whole system. So a hammer gets shoved back, it catches the sear, which is right here. This is the sear. And the way these work, you have to be pushing forward on them for them to drop. It's kind of a cool little way of doing it once you understand how everything functions. But it catches the sear, and then you're ready for your next shot. The next paintball falls in place, you pull the trigger, sear drops, everything flies forward, hits the valve, blast of air goes through the bolt, a little bit of air comes back and pushes the hammer back, and then everything resets. So that's the basics of how a stack tube blowback will function. One of the biggest things when you're tearing these apart is you have to put these valves back in a certain facing way. If you look at this, it might be kind of hard to see, but this front face is a little bit, this hole in front is a little bit bigger than the hole in the back. The bigger hole will always go forward, and the reason for that is you need to flow all of the air through this front face that's both going out the barrel and resetting the marker. The smaller hole is going back because you're only pushing a little bit of air through there that's resetting the marker. So just remember that, and you can be set. Sometimes be careful on these valves. This one, there's a hole all the way through it, but sometimes one of these will be drilled hole and the other one will only be an inset, and so it's not drilled through all the way. If you have a case where you only have one hole drilled either on the top or the bottom, the hole will go up, so that will be facing the bolt. The inset will go down because sometimes what they do is these set screws that hold them in place, they only go a little bit of the way in, and so they make it so no air can escape out of this set screw by drilling that hole only halfway. So big hole on the valve face facing forward and hole facing up. This one, since it has a hole drilled all the way through, it doesn't matter which way it goes, up or down, but it still does matter front and back. Other things to consider on these, there's not a whole lot that goes on in these trigger frames that you need to worry about unless something has gone wrong. Usually there's 2 springs, a couple of pins hold the whole thing together, and there's no seals, there's no air goes through these. So every once in a while I'll hear somebody saying, oh, my trigger is leaking air. Well, it's not actually your trigger that's leaking air. What's happening is usually this valve screw that holds everything in place is what's leaking, or the air is leaking out of this channel. This is where the sear comes up into the marker. The air can be leaking through there, which means it's getting past the valve. So if you have air leaking, there's 2 seals it has to be, one of 2 seals it has to be making its way past. That's either the front face for the poppet valve here, which seals against the valve face here, or this front O-ring on the valve. If this front O-ring is leaking, usually what happens is the air comes out and it'll come out through the barrel, since that's the easiest way for it to get out. Sometimes it'll still come out through this trigger area, because it'll go into the back of the lower tube. So if it's leaking, air absolutely, and it's leaking internally, air absolutely has to be getting past those 2. The other areas it can leak from, just follow your air. Your tank's going to be out here. Here's your first macro fitting. If it's leaking from there, it's pretty obvious. If it's leaking from anything in your macro hose, it's pretty obvious. If it's leaking from your volumizer areas, those are going to be seals. There's seals at the top and the bottom. This one is going to be in the front. So if those 2 are leaking, it can come out of this grip frame screw here, or not the grip frame screw, the screw that holds in the front block. Or that can also show up in between the 2, so it could be coming out like right here. But air will come all the way up until about here, and it'll stop here. So if you're seeing a leak, it's got to be getting past something up in this area. That's kind of the basics of this. I'm a really big fan of this design, especially for new players, because it's so simple. You just got to remember to put your valve in the right way. After that, if you got a leak, there's only a couple things that it can be causing it. And once you understand the basics of the design, it actually translates really well into upper end markers. So say this is an E-Tech 3 I have here. It's a high end, it's electro-pneumatic. It uses a computer board to control a solenoid, which controls a ram. The ram functions almost exactly like this hammer does here. I say almost because there are some slight differences, but the basics of this design is all right here. There's still a valve, there's still something that hits the valve to open it, the air comes up through the valve and goes out through the bolt, and you can see there's a hole in the bolt there, just like there's one here. You know, everything's a little bit different, but the basics of the design are all here. This includes a couple of regulators on it. You've basically just made this design a little more refined, complicated, I guess you'd say, but you do have more control over it. But if you move from something like this onto like an E-Tech, an Ego, a Vanguard Creed, there is just tons of these poppet platforms out there. You can understand the basics of the design. So that's essentially it for this guy. I'm gonna reassemble this guy, but I don't think you guys really need that. It's just everything in reverse. Put it all back in. There's no real crazy great way you need to go about it. I guess the only thing is make sure your valve's in the correct way, and don't forget to put your spring in place before you bolt this front block back on, because if you don't do that, you got to take it back apart. That's about it. So thanks for watching. This is Turbo's Tech Table. If you guys have any questions, comments, want to see anything in particular, let me know. I'm always open. I'm still kind of getting getting used to this, so if you guys got some constructive criticism, let me know. Yeah, thanks for watching.